Ruth chapter 2 and 3, it's a lot to cover. That's why I didn't have Lee read the whole 2 chapters there. I actually wanted to do a little bit like we did last week of having some readers' theater there with different people reading the different parts in the passage, but I couldn't pull that off this week. It's a lot because the story's starting to turn. You remember last week when Randy began the scripture reading, he started with the last verse of the book of Judges, which basically says there was no king, and every man did what was right in his own opinion. And I also shared with you that the book of Ruth concludes a 3-part drama that starts in the end of the book of Judges. Because Judges 17 through 18 has a man who leaves Bethlehem and then a tragic event happens. Judges 19 through 21 has another man leave Bethlehem and again a horrible event happens. And in Ruth chapter 1, a man from Bethlehem named Elimelech, whose name means God is king, leaves Bethlehem and a tragic event unfolds. And the author, picking up on the end of the book of Judges, is raising this question: is this the end? Is this just like before? Is Bethlehem a place of shame? What will happen? And how is God involved with the sorrows and joys of his children? And we looked at that in chapter 1 last week. Darkness in Bethlehem. And there's a word that is woven in a concept throughout the book of Ruth, and it's the Hebrew word hesed. And there's no one English word that can convey that word perfectly because it's expressive of a lot of different things, particularly relationships. And the Hebrew word hesed ties together the idea of a covenantal loyalty, faithfulness, kindness, goodness, mercy. Surely goodness and mercy, that's the word there. Shall follow me all the days of my life. Mercy, love, and compassion. And that idea is expressed in God's people to other people. It's also expressed by God to people. And it lies at the heart of some of the high points of this story here, which is really the story of Naomi, even though we call it the book of Ruth. Hesed. It's going to come out in chapter 2 and 3. It's also in her lows. Because the world that Naomi grew up in was built on Yahweh, the covenant God of Israel, the one true God, his hesed, his covenant loyalty, his love, his mercies, his loving kindness, as many times it's translated, for his people. That was the bedrock of Israel's nation and of the nation's faith and hope. That was the glue that held together the history of her people. Read the Psalms and you'll read about the kindness, the mercies of God over and over. His mercy endures forever. That was the bedrock of Israel here. His promise and his promise of their future. God had pledged himself to them. He had done it in Abraham. Remember the covenant with Abraham. Abraham fell asleep. In this part of the covenant, God put him asleep, and God walks through the scattered carcasses there that represent the blood trail of what he would accomplish. He was their God. They were his people. They grew confidence and hope from the fact that Yahweh was abounding in love. Exodus 34, that's what makes him God. Yet, is that what Naomi's sensing? The warmth of his care? The care of his wing? The steadfastness of his hesed, his loving kindness? No, Naomi feels like she's been exposed to the elements and not in a place of refuge. And so here in the wake of one tragedy after another, her husband, then her son, then her other son, in Moab, away from God's promised land, the thought of God's mercy becomes in her mind not a comfort per se, but it seems like, in her perspective, a contradiction. There's confusion there. She is weather-beaten. She is dried up. And her distress, we can begin to understand when we understand what the basis of Israel's life was created to live in. God's mercy, to dwell in his love, to live off of his nurturing care. To having God's mercy is the best thing that can happen to anybody. and she feels like nothing is worse than living without it. That's her perception here. So she's certainly grieving that her life has fallen to pieces. She is not doubting God's existence. She is lamenting. She feels that she has lost the experience of Yahweh's loving kindness. That is the loss that she's really feeling. And so she feels empty. Empty. And God's mercy is the centerpiece of Ruth's story, to show that it never left. It was Naomi's perception rather than reality. But it's a question that sooner or later, if you live as a human being in this world, you will have to face. Can you think of a time in your life when you felt you had reason to doubt God's love for you? Why is it sometimes difficult for Naomi and for us to believe that God is overflowing in mercy? In chapter 1 of the book of Ruth, we can see that lament of Naomi has that's very similar to the lament of the Psalms and the psalmists. Naomi can say at the end of chapter 1, I am not okay. I am widowed, I am empty, and life tastes bitter. I am not okay. And we close the end of last week in Ruth 1 of her saying that, but she's also saying, and I'm coming back. I'm going to take that step. I'm coming back. Because I heard in Bethlehem that God has visited his people. She doesn't know what will happen, but she knows God has visited his people. She's not moving away from God. She's moving toward him. And it seems like he's against me in her perception, but she is not running away. She is coming back. Because Naomi and Ruth had both seen things that you can't see with dry eyes and without broken hearts. The book of Ruth shows us that God is faithful in his covenant love. He is good. He is sovereign, and not a cold way, a warm way. And our God brings life out of death, bread out of famine, fullness out of emptiness, and sweetness out of bitter. In the end of Ruth chapter 1, our challenge was come back. Come back. What's the next step? Come back. And do you remember the last verse there? They came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest. That's how it ends. If chapter 1 was like a room where the lights had gone out and life was a desert and it was darkness in Bethlehem, then at midnight, then chapter 2 is like 6 a.m. this morning. Were you up at 6 a.m.? I woke up at 4:48, which is a little early for me. And I couldn't go back to sleep. And I looked out, and it was still dark, of course. And then I looked out again a little bit later, and I could start to see a little bit of light over the horizon on the hill. The sun is peeking up over the horizon. Here is the first ray of light. And Naomi, she feels forgotten, but as her experience now is like watching a heart monitor gone flat. And she suddenly sees, in this passage here, the flicker of a pulse. It's an exhilarating moment. It's the best possible news for a despairing Naomi. For now she knows, and it's going to grow, it's going to snowball. She knows that God's Hesed is still there, and it always was, and it is meant for her as well. So scene 1, chapter 2. We hear in the very first verse there, the author introduces this man named Boaz. We don't know how he's going to fall into the picture here, but he's introduced here, and it's translated as a mighty man of wealth. That's one way you can translate it, but usually when it talks about a mighty man, it's talking about a man of character. A man of character. He is a man of character, and we're also introduced that he is related to Naomi's husband, who's buried in Moab. And then we see in chapter 2 in verse 2, where Ruth doesn't sit still, and she does not know Boaz, but she knows chapter 1, verse 6, that God has visited his people in Bethlehem and given them bread. She knows chapter 1, verse 22, that it's the beginning of barley harvest. She knows what God's law says, because probably Naomi instructed her in God's law, about what the poor and the foreigner can do if they don't have any resources in this new land. And she acts on what she knows about God and what she knows about the customs of this new land that she has embraced. And she's going to see not only that, if she can go get some grain from the edges of the field that the landowners were supposed to leave for the poor and the foreigner, but she's going to press a little bit further into that, because look what she says. She says in verse 2, "Let us now go to the field and glean ears of corn," it's grain, it's barley. "After him," you notice the him there is inserted by the translators, "after in whose sight I shall find grace." She's going to press into that. She doesn't just want to go and glean what was available here. She wants to find somebody she can find favor with. Favor with. That's not insignificant, because she's going beyond. She keeps taking these extra steps, these extra courageous steps, fueled by faith and God's covenant loyalty to her as a Gentile, a Moabite, and she's going to press into that. She doesn't sit still. She wants to find favor in the owner of a field. Here's how it would work. The men would cut the grain. Then it would be gathered behind by women who would be hired, who would gather it up and bundle it into sheaves. The corners of the field were to be unharvested, according to Leviticus 19 and 23 and Deuteronomy 24. And the grain that was dropped, they were to leave for the poor in the village and the foreigner passing through to be able to get it. The question is, how big do you make your corners? How much do you drop? How tightly do you follow the law? What if some of the people took advantage of the provision and took more than they should have? You can see that it's more complex than we think. And you also know how the human heart works. You can see how the heart of humanity could play in selfishness, it could play in greed, both in those who would come, the poor, and the harvesters who may harass them. Plus, remember, what's the setting? When is this happening in Israel's history? This is the time of the judges where everyone does what? Right in their own eyes. There's not a sense of morality here. And this little village of Bethlehem had a shameful situation a couple times in the book of Judges. It was a mixed bag both ways. And verse 3 says, "And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and it just so happened he was to light upon a part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family or relation kindred of Elimelech." It just so happened that the particular field that she finds, she has no idea, belongs to this guy Boaz, introduced in verse 1, who's related to her past father-in-law, who she doesn't know him. So what's going to happen? What kind of situation will this turn out like? We already know what kind of a woman Ruth is. She's loyal to Yahweh. She has proven loyal to her mother-in-law. In chapter 1, she's acting in faith. She's working hard to provide. What kind of a guy is he? And what will the God of coincidences, the God of just so happened, do? Well, look in verse 4. We're told he's a man of character. And verse 4 says, "And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they answered him, 'The Lord bless you,'" Yahweh. We find out that Yahweh is central in his life. Not like Judges. Every man does that which is right in his own eyes. We find out that he wants God's blessing, God's hesed, on his workers' lives. And then as we keep reading, he notices Ruth and how hard she's working and asks about her. And he also wants hesed on Ruth. Because he's going to offer, if you keep reading in the rest of chapter 2, not just the edge of the field, not just the corner of the field, but he's going to say to his hands, his reapers there, Don't harass her. Let her walk with you as the grain is cut and pick up what's on the ground and even throw more behind you. He wants her to receive that. And so among there, he lets her join with the reapers, or the hired harvesters. He protects her from harassment. And he then invites her to join them for lunch and be able to drink out of the waters of his well here, what he's provided for his workers. And so blessing and refuge and fullness he wants to provide under Yahweh. And he has a conversation with her in verse 11. She's blown away. Notice she says in verse 10, she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found grace in your eyes?" That's what she wanted to do, right? At the beginning, verse 2, find an owner of a field and find grace, find favor. That you should take knowledge of me, seeing I'm a stranger, I'm a foreigner. And Boaz answered and said to her, "It's been fully showed me all that you've done unto your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother in the land of where you were born, land of nativity, and are come to a people which you knew not heretofore. The Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust." And she says, "Let me find favor in your sight, for you have comforted me, and you have spoken friendly unto your servant and handmaid, though I not be like unto one of your handmaids." Boaz invites her further into his provision. Dinner, security, plenty in verses 14 through 16. That's the kind of guy this guy is. Ruth, she wanted to find favor. That's her prayer. God answers her prayer. She doesn't just find some grain, she finds a relationship. There is courage in her life. In verse 10, there is humility, there is diligence. Verses 17 through 18, she's working hard. She took everything, about an ephah of barley, that could be about 60 pounds of grain. She took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. And she brought forth and gave to her what was reserved after she was sufficed, after she had been satisfied. She said, "Where'd you work today?" She harvests it, she threshes it, which means you take a pole and you beat it. I mean, this is hard work after being in a hot field all day in the Mediterranean sun there. And she carries it back to the village. Then you got the next scene. She's back to Naomi, and she's got a whole week's worth of grain that she got in one day. And Naomi's impressed with the quantity, and she recognizes in verse 19 that Ruth's prayer is answered. She's found favor. She finds out who it is. It's Boaz. And here it is. Through this Moabite woman's kindness, her hard labor, her courage, her loyalty, her faith, and the relative Boaz and his kindness and mercy, the woman who said in chapter 1, "Call me Mara, for my life is bitter, not pleasant. I'm under God's frown, I'm empty," can now see that the sun is rising above the horizon. Naomi can see this now, coming up from the darkness of the night. She can see what God already knows, what he's been working on in her darkness, that he's faithful to his promise, that his promise to her dead husband and her sons and to her and Ruth, that he is still living. He's alive. And you start to see life in Naomi. Her perspective changes. She's revived. The wheels start to turn in her mind. And she starts to use her imagination because she can now see what God can do and God at work. She sees the heart monitor. She sees there's a pulse, and it's hers because of God's mercy. And so, chapter 3, next scene. Because if God can do that, and this is how testimonies and God working other people's lives can help us, right? We can see pictures of God work. If God can do that, and verse 3 of chapter 2 said it just so happened the particular field she finds belongs to this guy, well, then she understands here that Naomi had understood that God had visited his people, the Lord had given them bread, and God is the great king who defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow. He loves a foreigner residing among you, gives them food and clothing, then can he restore our family that looked like it was going to die out? Chapter 3, verse 1. Naomi, your mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, shall I not seek rest or security for you, that it may be well with you? Now Boaz, whose young women you are with, is he not our relative? And she hatches a plan. And the plan is simply this. Okay, Ruth, if this is how God worked, let's take the next bold step, and Ruth, you propose to him. It's really what she's saying here. You see, in every Israelite family, two issues were paramount. Carolyn Custis James wrote this: the survival of the family name and keeping family land in family hands was priority. The Elimelech family ran into trouble on both counts. Famine drove them off their land, and the death of Elimelech and his two sons threatened the family with extinction. Moses' law, however, carried provisions to save a dying family and protect the ownership of their land. This Levirate law addressed the situation where a man died without an heir. Under this law, his brother was required to marry the widow, and the son born from this union would carry forth the line of the deceased, and the widow would be sheltered. This is the duty of a brother-in-law, and great shame and dishonor fell on the man who refused to fulfill this obligation. And this law focused on the land and encompassed a wider range of relatives if there is no brother. So when a man fell into hard times and was forced to sell his land, his nearest relative, a kinsman redeemer, was called to step in and purchase the land or buy it back from an outsider to keep the relative's property from coming under the ownership of someone outside their tribe. Both laws were costly and involved enormous sacrifice. Since a father's estate was divided among the sons, when one son died childless, the surviving brother's inheritance automatically increased. The family pie was sliced into fewer and therefore larger pieces. And according to the law, the brother's whose duty it was to marry the widow was spoiling his own inheritance if he succeeded in fathering a son by her, because those lovely larger pieces of the pie would shrink in size again, because there was one more heir. You can see the risk here. So Naomi has gathered info, and she has planned a proposal, literally, for Ruth. End the widowhood. She has Naomi shed the widowhood clothing. Start new and fresh, literally, and carry on the family line. And she's going to trust God for the outcome. Verse 4 says, then it shall be when he lies down, you shall notice the place where he lies. You shall go in, uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what you should do. What does Ruth say? I'll do it. What? A foreigner to a Jewish man? You know what risk she's taking here? But should we be surprised? She goes there, and Boaz has had a big day. They've harvested, and where they thresh the wheat, he's eating and drinking. And he's just gonna sleep out there tonight with his stuff. Don't want anybody taking it. He's out there sleeping. She comes in at night, and while he's sleeping, she lifts his leg up over his feet here, and she lies at the bottom of his feet. Well, as he's sleeping, you know how it gets at night when the sun goes down, it gets cold. He wakes up, and he's startled to see there's a woman at his feet. That's not what you expect to see in the threshing floor at night. And he says, what are you doing here? Who are you? It's dark. And she says in verse 10, I'm your servant Ruth. She said, do the symbolic thing and put that corner of the garment over me here, because you, according to the law, are my kinsman redeemer. You should marry me, is what she's saying. Well, she does a play on words here. And she says, as she asked him to spread the corner of her garment over me, she's literally saying, spread your wings over me. You remember what Boaz had prayed for her? May, as you come into the loyalty of Yahweh and you've taken refuge in him, may he spread his wings over you. You know what she's saying to Boaz? I love that prayer, and you're going to be the one that does it. She calls him to his prayer for her. He's a man of integrity. She's a woman of integrity. We are not told anything of impropriety went on. Here's what I want you to see here. Living by faith means hanging on to God's chesed, his loving kindness, and trusting him. Even when we're looking at him from ground zero. Can you trust his providence? What's providence? One professor, Stanley Gren, said this: according to the Bible, God does not set the wheels of the universe in motion and then abandon it to run it on its own. Instead, he enters into relationship with what he has made. Providence focuses on God's activity in guiding the historical process with the goal of bringing to pass his intention for the world he creates. God's involved with his creation. But here's the cool thing about providence, because he enlists through his providence the participation. There's something called concurrence. It's a big theological word, but it means this with providence: that God, in whom we have confessed faith, declared faith, invites us to participate with him in the completion of his program for the world. In other words, his method of getting things done is working through his image bearers. Which means this, as this story very clearly shows in this audacious and bold faith, that we aren't necessarily only spectators to what God is doing in the world, but we are also participants by his grace. From the beginning and still today, God has a great plan for the world that comes as he guides the ship to its end, but it comes through us participating in that. In fact, God's providence is the strongest incentive that God gives us for acting with him. And how this plays out in the book of Ruth is amazing. As you read this book, you will find that these are people who are praying. These are people who are trusting God. Prayer is woven into their conversations here. They're trusting God and talking to him for God to do something. And they end their sentences by appealing for God to do it. But they don't stop with prayer. They move from prayer into action. They get off their knees. They take the next step that they can see here to participate in the answers to their own prayers. So Naomi blesses her daughters in chapter 1. That's all she could see. I hope you guys find husbands and the Lord bless you, because you have been kind to living in the dead. She blesses them to find rest in the house of a new husband. And now Naomi's involved in finding a new husband. She didn't know that before. Boaz blesses the harvesters. The Lord bless you. And the harvesters end up blessing Ruth and Naomi. Boaz blesses Ruth to be under the wings of Yahweh for reward and refuge. And Ruth steps out on faith to push into that risk with favor here. And she asked Boaz to be the one in whom under his wings and refuge she can find. Naomi starts to get this too. She takes the risk for this plan for Ruth, and Ruth calls Boaz to be that one through whom Yahweh's refuge and reward come through. And as someone has wisely said, more often than not, when we dust for God's fingerprints, because it was pretty dry and dusty, and Naomi couldn't see God's fingerprints very well in chapter 1. But what we'll find many times is we come up with the prints of one of his image bearers, or reflecting him. You know the old joke about the guy who waits on top of the roof, waiting for rescue from a raging and rising flood, right? Bunch of people in boats and helicopters and rafts all offer to help, and he refuses them all, says he's waiting on God to save him so God alone can receive the glory, and he drowns. And in heaven he says, why didn't you rescue me, God? And God said, I sent a boat, a helicopter, a raft, but you were too foolish. The story is obviously a little bit of an oversimplification, but it's a reminder about being passive in the prayers that you raise to the Lord. We do not please God by recklessness, certainly, nor by cowardice, but when we seek him, diligently seek him, but believe that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him, he's a great underwriter. He underwrites courage. He blesses a boldness that has stepped out on faith. And here in the days of the judges, out of famine, death in Moab, we have a God who takes the mustard seed of faith and out of his character, his covenant loyalty of relationship has said, he takes the prayer and faith and has said of his people's loyalty and he blesses them beyond what we can think so far. You remember what we said last Sunday? That God blesses the unfaithful. We are all recipients of that, aren't we? We are so unfaithful and God has blessed us. But there is also a special way that God takes people who are walking in relationship with him, who are loyal to the Lord, and he takes that blessing and he can focus it in an intense way. It can affect greater and greater circles, but also it can extend in an intense line into generations to come. And that's what the Lord is doing through people at various degrees of faithfulness, like Ruth and Boaz, and now Naomi. Naomi is encouraged by other people's faithfulness and seeing God at work in their lives, and she's becoming more faithful here. What you will find is the God you have prayed to, you got to know then what next to do. One foot on the next rock in front of you on the fog, the next handhold. And what you'll find is when you put your foot down hard on the truth of God and his promise, and you go forward, and despite the fear of the unknown, what you will find is that God is enough, and the demands of life are no match of the grace and power and faithfulness of our sovereign God. That is resurrection power at work. But there's a kink. There's a kink. The kink is here at the end. Boaz says, I'm all in, but I'm not the closest relative. He sends her off with more food, and then Boaz will go and investigate what needs to be done. But are you worried about the kink? I mean, if you got up to this mountain, are you worried about the next little hill here? Though there is a kink, and it might seem at the end of this passage here that the fog has drifted in again, they will trust God whatever the outcome, because if he can bring them bread out of famine, he can bring them relationship out of loneliness. This situation too, this kink, can be trusted in the hands of a God who does only good no matter what they see or understand. It's dawn in Bethlehem. It's not full day. It's dawn. And in fact, the sun came up and a little cloud went over it. But it's dawn. Can you trust him? You can. Yes. Boaz, Ruth, and Naomi show us that. They're ordinary human beings, folks, with an extraordinary God. But the question is now for all of us out of this passage, will you trust him too? And participate with him in faith to what he's calling you to do for his kingdom and where your walk is. Let's pray.